this is really just the beginning. And as AI becomes more embedded in consumer health tools, the big question really isn't whether these technologies will shape healthcare, it's how quickly the policy framework will evolve to keep pace with that.
Hello, and welcome to a very special podcast of FDA Watch. As you know, we're the leading independent, nonpartisan podcast on FDA. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. I'm very excited about this episode. It's the final installment in our signature multi-episode series that we produce in collaboration with law firms and other organizations. Today's episode is the fourth in the series we're doing with Covington, well-known law firm, practicing in the food and drug field for many, many decades. This series is called Medical Device Regulation, Compliance, and Policy. We're focusing on the cutting-edge issues facing medical device companies and FDA stakeholders. In our first episode, which you can listen to on fdawatch.net, and I'll repeat that several times during our podcast, fdawatch.net. In the first episode, we talked about diagnostics regulation, including laboratory-developed tests. In the second one, we focused on global medical device issues in Europe, in China. In our third segment, we focused on the False Claims Act with three attorneys from Covington. And today we're going to be talking about one of the hottest issues in the entire FDA regulatory space, digital health and the consumer. And we have four guests who are going to take us on that journey. First up is Kristin Davenport. Kristin is a partner in the Covington, D.C. office. She advises medical device companies on regulatory and compliance matters across the entire device lifecycle. Next up is Christina Kuhn. She is a counsel also in the Covington, D.C. office. She advises medical devices, life sciences, and technology companies on FDA regulation of AI, software, and digital health products. She helps navigate the FDA medical device framework. Also joining us today is Olivia Dworkin. Olivia is an associate in Covington's Los Angeles office. She advises medical device and digital health and technology companies on FDA issues. Her work centers on emerging medical technologies. And finally, let's welcome Jackie Haydock. Jackie is a digital health lawyer and technology executive, currently serving as Chief Healthcare Compliance Officer and Associate General Counsel at Meta. She leads healthcare compliance for Meta for emerging health technologies. Over her career, she's advised on many, many issues, and she previously was with Microsoft and Zimmer Biomet. I want to start out with a basic question, Kristin, for you. Digital health obviously is one of the most interesting topics in the healthcare environment. We all see digital health products. I want to ask you, just generally speaking, what is digital health in a few sentences, but mainly, what are the global trends that are shaping digital health and consumerism, and how is AI changing that landscape?
Thank you, Wayne. And I'll probably leave the definition of digital health to Christina and Olivia when we get more into the specifics of what type of products we'll be discussing in this episode. But I'd like to start by exploring the evolving landscape of digital health and AI. As we all know, the idea of what consumer-facing digital health is has grown and changed significantly over time. FDA's guidances on digital health came out over a decade ago, and at that point, digital health was a brand new term, and no one really knew what digital health was or what it meant. When the wellness guidance that we'll be discussing in this podcast was first issued, the main physiological parameter we thought of as wellness was heart rate. For example, heart rate sensors that were incorporated in treadmills. But today, or over time, with the explosion of smartphones, sensors, and wearables, there are more and more physiological parameters that were traditionally only measured in a clinical setting and that were being viewed as having wellness uses. So consumers wanted to know what these parameters are in their daily lives, not just when visiting the doctor once a year. And so what we see today is an evolved digital health landscape. So for example, think of the wearable products like watches or the rings that you may be seeing people wear at the gym or out and about, or diet apps, or other wearables that track certain metrics. And there are also some products that are mixed and have both wellness and medical device features. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in our podcast, with functions to analyze information for clinical purposes. But with the evolution of digital health, the interesting point is there was a real sense of consumer ownership over health. So people wanted to understand what was going on with their body on a daily basis. And they wanted to understand their full health profile, which goes beyond just heart rate monitoring when exercising, for example.
Christina, same question. Your views on the global trends in digital health.
Yeah, to expand on what Kristin was saying, I think there's two trends that are happening at the same time that are really what's driving kind of the expansion of what you might consider consumer digital health. One is what Kristin mentioned, which is the expansions of the kinds of technologies and platforms that can measure various physiological parameters. So smartphones obviously, changed a lot of this in terms of what could be done digitally in the palm of your hand by a patient. But we now have smartphones and watches and headphones and glasses and, purpose-built sensors, all in the consumer space. And the other is the trend that Kristin was talking about of the broader sense of what is health and what is relevant to health. It's not just I'm being diagnosed with a condition, I'm in the ICU being monitored, that these kind of clinical parameters have a real relevance to how I think about my day-to-day and how I make choices on a day-to-day. I think, glucose is a really tangible example of that. For a long time, you only measured your glucose if you were diabetic and trying to manage your diabetes, or if you were being diagnosed with diabetes. But there's, the last couple of years, a sense of, well, actually my daily response to food and my glucose is relevant to my just general health. And it's a good idea to maybe minimize glucose spikes, even within the kind of realm of normal glucose for a healthy individual. But the technology that was available at the time, right, you had to kind of prick your finger with a needle, squeeze out a little drop of blood onto a tester, put that into a meter. It just wasn't something, a person was going to do just kind of out of curiosity for their regular health. You were only going to do that if you really needed to do that to manage a condition. And then along came these continuous glucose monitors where you can stick a sensor on and it just continuously kind of measures that glucose without any real intervention by the user. And so suddenly I can kind of see a full picture of my response to, my lunch or my dinner without having to do 1,000 finger sticks. And so that data both is now available because the technology has evolved, and also there's a growing sense of how that might be relevant to me. And so I think that's just a good example of those two trends coming together to move a lot of things into consumers' hands, to broaden the sense of what we think is relevant to health. I think that raises the question of now, what do I do with all this data that I'm measuring on my phone and on my watch and all these things? But that's, I think maybe where the AI can come in.
Yeah, Olivia, I want to turn to you and ask you a similar question. Talk about the key innovations that we're now seeing in digital health. AI is changing all of our lives these days. How is it changing digital health and the use of products that people use themselves to evaluate their own health?
Absolutely. It is. It's hard to talk about global trends shaping digital health and consumerism without talking about AI. A big theme that we're seeing is patients are really expecting healthcare to function more like the rest of their digital lives. They want healthcare to be accessible. They want it to be personalized. They want it to be available on demand at their fingertips. And AI is really accelerating that shift. We're seeing AI tools making it very easy for people to access reliable health information, often through things like chatbots or digital assistants that can answer questions at the speed of light, offer health and wellness tips, or help patients prepare for clinical visits with their doctors. And so we're seeing this shift where patients, instead of spending hours maybe searching online or piecing together articles that they find, they are increasingly having information and education right at their fingertips. And at the same time, to Christina's point, AI is helping to unlock the value of the enormous amount of health data that's already being collected from this growing base of wearable products. And from electronic health records to wearable devices and other digital health tools. That data that's being collected can be used to generate insights that are more personalized for users and really actionable for patients, whether that's helping them better understand their conditions or their test results, or helping them track trends in their health data, or making the most out of their visits with their doctors so they can approach those conversations in a more informed manner. So all of this is really contributing to a broader shift towards a more consumer-centric healthcare model where patients are not just really passive recipients of care, but more so active participants using AI, empowered by AI, who have greater visibility into their own health information and generally available health information, and they have the tools to really effectively engage with the overall healthcare system.
Right. And FDA clearly has a role in this and has assumed a role in it, although it continues to define what its role is. At the beginning of this year, FDA released revised guidance on general wellness. Let me ask Christina and then Olivia, what are the key takeaways from the FDA guidance as they relate to digital health? How did FDA advance the definition, and how did FDA advance the regulatory oversight principles that they're applying?
Yeah, we were talking about kind of the consumer trends, the technology trends, but obviously FDA, as you say, Wayne, plays a role here. And there was a bit of waiting for FDA to catch up to clarify the FDA lines. FDA for a long time has had this concept of general wellness products that they're not going to regulate because they're related to kind of healthy lifestyle choices and not a disease or condition. And then obviously medical devices that they do regulate, products that have an intended use in diagnosing, treating, mitigating disease. And the guidance that existed was clear that things relate to healthy lifestyle choices, diet, nutrition, sleep, were not going to be regulated. But it hadn't really addressed these tools that measure a physiological parameter and report that out. So other than kind of heart rate, which we've known for a long time, is relevant when you're exercising, are you hitting your fat burning zone or whatever it may be for heart rate, we didn't have a lot of clarity on things like glucose and pulse oximeters and blood pressure. And there was these emerging questions. FDA had cleared as medical devices continuous glucose monitors with a wellness intended use. And so that raised the question, if those have a wellness intended use, why are they being cleared as medical devices? And then this past summer, we saw a warning letter be issued to a company that was marketing blood pressure indicator as a wellness parameter. And the warning letter essentially said blood pressure is inherently clinical, because telling someone they have a high blood pressure reading is essentially telling them they have the condition high blood pressure, and there's no way to put that in the wellness regulatory framework, even if you try to characterize it as wellness. That was an interesting one because the company, which is somewhat unusual in the response to a warning letter, publicly said they continue to disagree with FDA. They're going to continue to market that parameter, notwithstanding the warning letter. At the same time, we had the Secretary of HHS supporting the use of wearables broadly in wellness. And then at the beginning of this year, as you said, we got a new wellness guidance in which FDA explicitly addressed these parameters, saying sensor-based technologies that measure physiological parameters can be wellness products, meaning they're not going to be regulated by the agency as devices, if they have a wellness intended use, so a role in kind of maintaining a general state of health, and are not invasive. The guidance really walked back that warning letter because it included an example of a blood pressure wellness product, and also clarified why FDA had cleared those continuous glucose monitors, because FDA's view was those sensors have a needle that penetrates the skin, which FDA viewed as invasive or not invasive, so it didn't fall under that scope of wellness.
Let me ask Christina a follow-up question. Is there confusion in the marketplace by the marketplace, I don't mean the consumer marketplace, but within your clients with regard to where FDA stands? Then I want to ask Olivia to discuss the considerations for AI. But first, Christina, follow up to what you were saying in terms of where FDA is these days. Is there confusion about where they are?
There was confusion, I think, before this new guidance came out, because we were looking at the various bits and pieces of FDA action and what was in the market, and it wasn't all really aligned. I think the guidance really goes a long way towards clarifying the agency's position on what can be wellness and what you need to do to stay on that non-regulated side of the line.
Right. Olivia, let me ask you to add on to whatever you want to Christina's answer.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what Christina was saying. In the revised guidance, it is apparent that FDA is still sort of drawing these lines around what qualifies as a non-device general wellness product and what crosses the line into regulated medical device territory. So while the revised guidance did open the door for more products to be considered general wellness, there is still that dividing line between something that's intended solely for general wellness use and something that is intended for clinical purposes. So Kristin mentioned this a little bit earlier, but classic examples of things that we typically think of in this wellness bucket is wearable devices such as those watches, wristbands, or rings that track things like your step count or your heart rate or your sleep patterns, or applications that may help you plan healthy meals or track your macros or guide a meditation session. Where things make it a little bit more complicated is that there are a lot of digital health products on the market now that combine both wellness and clinical features. So for example, you could have a wearable product that would track general health metrics for fitness purposes, but also include a function that analyzes health data to detect irregularities that may be relevant for a clinical purpose, such as detecting AFib or sleep apnea or another medical condition. So when products start performing those kinds of clinical analyses, that's where FDA oversight can come into play. And the guidance provided a little bit more clarity on if companies want to stay on the wellness side of the line, there are still some things that the products cannot do. So for example, the products can't reference specific diseases, the products cannot be intended to generate diagnoses or treatment recommendations. The general wellness product should not provide ongoing alerts that are really intended to help a patient manage a chronic disease or condition. The products can't output values that mimic values that are used clinically unless those values are validated. And then the products can't be positioned on the market as a substitute for something that is a cleared or approved medical device. And then finally, as Christina mentioned, FDA also said in the guidance that wellness products cannot be invasive, which the agency interpreted fairly broadly to include even things that are minimally invasive, like microneedle-based sensors. So there's a list of guardrails that you really have to stick to if you want to be on that wellness side of the line. And then another takeaway I wanted to discuss from the guidance is this concept of user notifications. Historically, there was some uncertainty over whether a product that analyzed data to generate notifications that were related to clinical care could fall within this general wellness bucket, or if those notifications would sort of automatically push that product into the medical device territory. The revised guidance clarifies that wellness products may include a notification, and I'm quoting from the guidance now, that informs a user that evaluation by a healthcare professional may be helpful when outputs fall outside ranges appropriate for general wellness use. But at the same time, in the guidance, the notifications must be carefully designed. So they, again, they cannot name diseases or conditions. They have to avoid characterizing outputs as abnormal, pathological, or diagnostic in those notifications. The notifications cannot reference clinical thresholds or diagnosis or treatment recommendation, and they can't sort of be provided on an ongoing basis for ongoing disease management. So this triggered a practical question for companies of what these notifications can say if they have to adhere to all of these restrictions. FDA did give a little bit more clarity on this question during a town hall earlier this year. The agency explained that ranges appropriate for general wellness use may rely on or be informed by things like clinical thresholds that are defined for a specific disease or condition. And they gave the example of 100 beats per minute as an accepted clinical threshold for tachycardia. But the notification should not include that actual numeric value of the threshold, name the specific medical disease or condition, or include design features like colors or sounds that signal that something is medically abnormal. What FDA said the notification can say is something more general, like your resting heart rate was high over the past few days, and you should check with your doctor if this is an unexpected result. One area where FDA seems to be providing a little bit more flexibility on these guardrails is for things like user-defined thresholds. So if a user sets their own limit where they want to be notified, such as a resting heart rate threshold, then the notification could reference that number. And that's perhaps because that notification would then be tied to the user's own settings rather than a clinical diagnostic standard.
Are we at the point now where you feel comfortable that we have clarity with regard to the definition between those products that are regulated and those that are not?
I do think we have clarity in the guidance on what is now on the wellness side of the line and what is on the clinical side of the line. So like Christina was describing earlier, there was historic uncertainty over whether there was any parameter or any physiological signal that was off the table for wellness. So if you measure or monitor blood pressure, you automatically cannot be a general wellness product. There was a question over what types of products would fall within that bucket. Mm-hmm. I think with the revised guidance, we have more clarity that perhaps there's no parameter that's categorically off the table. It's more about the claims that you make on what your product is intended to do. So if your claims are surrounding general wellness uses, and you're not sort of referencing diseases, you're not stating that the product is intended to diagnose or generate treatment recommendations, there is sort of a defined pathway for innovators to build products within the parameters that are discussed in the guidance.
Let me bring Jackie into this conversation now before we go to break. What are the biggest considerations for consumer product companies when they enter the regulated space of FDA with regard to these products?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne, and happy to be on the podcast today. So I'm going to answer the question as a lawyer, because that's what I am. But my answer really does focus on what I consider the three biggest, both legal and business considerations for consumer companies if and when they're entering the health regulated space. So number one is safety. Number two, compliance by design. And number three is your go-to-market or market access strategy. And so three is, do we have a reimbursement pathway? Is it available to be purchased through HSA, FSA? We don't have time on today's podcast to get into three. That's a whole topic in itself. So I'm going to double click on one and two, safety and compliance. So as a consumer health company is moving into the regulated health space, the guiding principle must be to put people's safety first. And this principle should shape every design decision, feature, user interaction. And a consumer company is already thinking about their consumer. So this is not novel and different, right? There's already a strong focus on consumer interest and needs, demands, safety, and trust. It's just amplified as they enter the health and regulated space. And if we as an industry, if we align that one of our guiding principles is people's safety, then compliance starts to feel a lot less burdensome. Because what we find is compliance programs actually, they help us meet our goals. Compliance programs are not just a regulatory checklist that have to be completed. They're really the infrastructure that help ensure this patient or consumer safety. So for consumer tech companies, it's easy to think that maybe compliance is going to slow you down. You're thinking, oh, I need new types of documentation, or maybe I need new or different processes. Is there additional review or approval needs to happen? Maybe. The answer to all those questions is yes. But the good news is, if you're proactive and bake it into your product and your culture from the beginning, what we find is that compliance by design is an enabler. Proactive compliance programs help companies make better product design choices. It helps companies anticipate risk and as well as gain trust with users and regulators. From a regulated industry perspective, consumer health companies are going to see regulations as a barrier to entry to the regulated space. But as I said, thoughtful and upfront compliance can become like a real differentiator for companies entering or transitioning from the consumer to regulated space. We see companies that embrace a strong compliance infrastructure, again, more easily able to gain trust, credibility, and overall stronger position in the market.
Let me ask each of you one more personal question. I don't usually get into personal questions here. Do you use digital health products, and how do you view them from a personal standpoint? What is your personal use of these products, and how does the fact that you know a lot about them and you know what FDA is doing and you see the applications that are going before the FDA and you know the people at FDA who are doing it, how does that influence what you personally, your personal use or your family's use of these products? Anybody want to take a shot at that one?
I'm happy to take a crack at answering that question, Wayne, from an industry perspective. Working in-house within tech, I do use tech on a regular basis. I wouldn't consider myself like a tech guru by any means, but what I think I'm most excited and passionate about are the opportunities that digital health, whether it's general wellness or a regulated product. But what we're seeing is the types of ailments, conditions, situations that digital health companies are able to tackle are typically what communities or groups that have been underrepresented, maybe in traditional medicine. And so we're seeing some really great traction with digital health tools, helping new parents or helping women entering menopause or helping women during pregnancy, different aging seniors. And so I think it's just such potential for digital health technologies to really make a difference in everyone's life. And again, from my perspective, I'm probably a little bit more fitness focused, but I love following the industry trends and seeing all the cool ideas that innovators are coming up with.
Okay. Anybody else want to answer from a personal standpoint?
Yeah, Wayne, I'll just add, I think to your question, I do think, as a regulatory attorney, having a more nuanced understanding of what's regulated or what's not does sometimes influence my thinking as a consumer. I'm aware of, is this a parameter or a measurement that has gone through FDA review or is it not? And I do maybe think about the weight I might put on the value of that data a little bit differently. I don't know that it makes me, as much as I see all the cool things that our clients are doing and taking through FDA, I maybe am not always at the forefront of adopting those, just in my own kind of personal ethos to keep things simple. And sometimes I'm like, more data is just more things I don't, know what to do with at this stage. But from a personal perspective, the sort of understanding the layers of regulation and what companies have had to go through to get, FDA clearance and the like, it does influence, how I might think about those products.
All right. Olivia, Kristin, anything to add?
For me, I'll just say that digital health is everywhere, so it's inevitable. It interfaces with my life almost every single day, from a FDA regulatory lawyer standpoint, I'll say it's been very exciting and inspiring to sort of have a front row seat at how these technologies have advanced over time. So even in the past 6 years or so that I've been at Covington, I remember I joined the firm around the time of the pandemic, and digital health was really booming at that time because we were thinking about how to get healthcare in people's homes, how to make sure that people don't have to leave their homes if they don't have to, how to use digital health technologies to enhance things like decentralized clinical trials or help people monitor health while they're inside their home because they can't get to the doctor, or things like telehealth. So that's the era that I was really joining the firm and really getting integrated into these issues. And now that technology has really boomed, and now we have AI and generative AI. And I think next year we'll probably have a new form of technology that's not on our radar yet. So being able to see all of that unfold has been really exciting from my perspective.
I'll just add one personal example. I was fascinated. I have a family member with atrial fibrillation, and seeing the Apple Watch actually pick up that condition at home in my living room was fascinating. The fact that we have something that someone can just wear on their wrist and diagnose a condition like atrial fibrillation. I think if you had told me that 10 years ago, I would have probably questioned that. So it's fascinating what it can do, in your everyday life.
Yeah, it's always interesting to be in the FDA space. When you tell people at a party or you tell your neighbor you are involved with FDA and its products, inevitably, specific questions arise with regard to this drug or this food or this nutritional supplement or whatever. So this is always an interesting field to be in. And digital health being the future for a lot of people is going to be particularly interesting, I think. We're going to take a quick break now, but don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We're back. We're talking with three attorneys from Covington: Kristin Davenport, Christina Kuhn, Olivia Dworkin, and Jackie Haydock from Meta. And I want to ask you about the challenges. I'll start out with Kristin. The challenges in drawing the line between a wellness product and a regulated medical devices. What about multifunctional products? What makes that challenging from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, thank you for that question. From a regulatory perspective, the challenge obviously lies in the fact that part of the product is actively regulated by FDA and part of the product is not. And so we're increasingly seeing blended products, meaning products that combine, for example, general wellness features with regulated medical functions. And as hardware platforms and technology is expanding, we expect that these products are only going to get more complicated over time. So from a regulatory perspective, this creates gray areas and challenges. For example, as many people on this podcast might know, FDA has a guidance on multifunction products, where FDA recommends that a device function under review should, to the extent possible, be separated from other function in the design and implementation. And this is, as I mentioned, because only the device is regulated, although the other functions may impact the device part of the product. And so the impact of the non-device functions on the device need to be considered. But this all sounds easy if you can actually assume that the device and non-device functions can be easily delineated. And that delineation might be easy, for example, for software that sits on a general purpose platform and is easy to separate out as its own thing. But as I mentioned, we're seeing increasingly that products are becoming more blended, which may make it more difficult to say what part of this product is a device and what's a non-device. Now, what are the implications? What are the regulatory challenges? Being able to delineate device and non-device function has implications throughout the entire life cycle of the product. So, for example, from design validation, risk analysis, pre-market submissions, for example, 510Ks, but also through MDR reporting and correction and removal determinations. In all of those instances, you will need to determine what is the device. For example, if there's a complaint, if there's an adverse event, what did the complaint relate to, the device or the non-device function? And that's really the first question, and that's why the delineation is, or being able to delineate, is so important. There are also supply chain and quality systems considerations. So, for example, if you have a multifunction product, what part of the product is technically subject to supplier controls, for example? You could just have the entire product under supplier controls, but it's still, I think, important to determine what part of the product is technically required to be subject to supplier controls.
So I'm sure this keeps you very busy looking into these matters. Jackie, let me turn to you. What's your experience on the industry side?
Yeah, I would echo what Kristin said. I mean, the reality is for a multifunction product, we have different regulators for different functions. So if we look even just in the US, we have a consumer product that's multifunction. We have the FDA from safety and efficacy perspective. CPSC is going to look at general product safety for things like electrical hazards, choking risk, mechanical failures. We also have FCC for wireless, FTC for deceptive health claims. And that's just in the US. So in every jurisdiction is going to have some level of multi-regulator approach. So for industry folks, just encourage companies, as you're entering into the health space, to know you're not alone and having a number of regulators you're going to interact with, but also coordinate a legal, regulatory, and compliance strategy, right? Knowing that there might be different, depending on their jurisdictions, different requirements and applications. The other area I like to remind clients generally is that, as Kristin said, okay, so we have a multifunction product, and let's say we do have a good delineation as to what functions are regulated and not regulated. Intended use can actually evolve. So it's not a one-time decision, right? Intended use, which is the basis of whether a device is regulated as a medical device, it can change, right? So you can have a product team that has an intended use that is not regulated, and that product may graduate to sales and marketing, and claims are made that start to put us in the regulated space. So I think it's important from a multifunction perspective, do the determination early and often to ensure that there's, I think, legal, regulatory, compliance, and business alignment as to what functions, if any, are regulated and by whom.
Christina, I know you were involved in a situation where a product transitioned across regulatory categories. Can you share that anecdote with us and what lessons were learned along the way?
Sure. I talked earlier about the continuous glucose monitors and how glucose as a parameter has transitioned. But I think it's interesting to think about kind of really three transitions. There's a prescription medical device, and then a over-the-counter or home use medical device, and then wellness in terms of kind of the levels of consumerism or consumer access. And what's interesting, I think, in one example, you might think of products kind of transitioning from prescription to over-the-counter to wellness, but that's not always the case. And we've seen things where you kind of jump over the counter to go straight to wellness. So pulse oximeters, I think, is an interesting example. They're both pulse oximeters that measure blood oxygen saturation in vital sign monitoring in hospitals and clinics for a long time. They then came on the market as wellness for high-performance athletes or activities at high altitude where you're kind of trying to measure, am I kind of maximizing my athletic performance in the way that my body is, maintaining oxygen. But there were really no over-the-counter pulse oximeters. And, the question might be, well, why not? And over-the-counter can be challenging because you need a medical use, but a medical use that is appropriate for consumers to kind of self-select that device is appropriate for them and sort of self-monitor their use of that device. And I don't think there was a really clear conception of how might a consumer use pulse oximetry in their sort of daily life, because the conditions that would typically cause your oxygen saturation to drop are critical conditions. They're conditions that require real medical intervention and monitoring, and it's not something that we want folks doing kind of on their own at home. But as Olivia alluded to earlier, I think COVID changed that, because that was a situation where we did want people doing things at home, and blood oxygen saturation was becoming a clear indicator of when people, might be going from COVID they could manage at home to COVID they needed medical intervention for. And I think it created that use case. Not that we always have to wait for a pandemic to create the use case, but it is sometimes, everything comes down to intended use for medical devices. And sometimes thinking about, it's not just kind of, can I use it at home, but that difference between, is this a home use case that's a medical one? Is it a wellness one? What's appropriate for patients to be doing on their own? If it's something that's medical at home, how are we making that transition back into the clinic, into professional care when things get more critical? Kristin mentioned the atrial fibrillation detection. We're seeing other kind of these clinical indicators where they're not meant to be fully diagnosis, right? Something you still have to go to a doctor and get the real diagnosis, but they're an alert of some kind that it's medical. It's not wellness, it's medical, but it's appropriate for over the counter. So I think that's just interesting to think about those three cases and the way that things might go, not always linearly from, a higher kind of regulated category to a lower regulated category or vice versa. On a sort of product by product level, as others have alluded to, we often see people trying to go the other way, where they start into the market with a wellness product because the barriers to entry might be lower, and then moving into maybe a regulated device or a medical use case, as they have additional revenue, as they have additional time to validate that. And that raises some of their own questions. Things like, once you're ready to transition into the device world, then you start thinking about compliance with FDA's quality systems and design controls. But maybe already a lot of the design has happened while you were in that wellness phase and thinking, we're totally unregulated. And I think that goes to the point Jackie was raising earlier about, how are you sort of projecting forward and thinking about compliance and making sure you have that strategy at the front end so that you're not having to do things later to catch up.
Right. One final question, first for Olivia and then Jackie to wrap up our session here. What other messages, Olivia, would you want to deliver in terms of where digital health and the regulatory aspects are headed, including the use of AI?
One thing that I would really emphasize as a final takeaway here is that digital health and AI is not a passing trend. It's becoming a permanent part of the healthcare ecosystem, and the pace of innovation in this space is only going to accelerate. We're seeing rapid advances in the underlying technology, especially with AI and the ability to analyze large volumes of health data. And we're also seeing that demonstrated consumer demand for tools that really help people and patients understand and manage their health outside of traditional clinical settings. And we're also seeing regulators starting to acknowledge and validate that demand and that shift. So looking ahead, I think we'll continue to see FDA and other regulators engage more directly with AI in healthcare. FDA has already potentially signaled that additional AI-specific guidance may be coming, so that could provide more clarity on how these technologies are evaluated and if they'll be regulated, and if so, what the scope of that regulation would look like. And this is really just the beginning. And as AI becomes more embedded in consumer health tools, the big question really isn't whether these technologies will shape healthcare, it's how quickly the policy framework will evolve to keep pace with that.
Jackie, you have the final word on this.
Yeah, I think it's consumer health, as Olivia is saying, it presents such great opportunity to improve people's lives. And so I encourage innovators and companies to keep pursuing creative ideas. Embrace, don't fear compliance. Compliance is manageable. And the best way to manage a regulatory landscape is just thinking proactively, thinking ahead. And like I mentioned towards the beginning of the podcast, if we put human and people safety first, compliance by design will follow closely after, and we'll be doing great things for great people and improving health.
Right. Well, it's clear that we're at the beginning of digital health, the use of these products. They have yet to fulfill not only their technology, but also their potential in terms of helping people manage their own healthcare and to a certain extent, self-diagnose. I want to thank our guests, Kristin, Christina, Olivia, and Jackie, for really being very insightful about what's happening with regard to digital health generally and with regard to where FDA is. FDA clearly has a little bit of a ways to go in terms of defining what it wants and what it expects. And I think the guests that we had today are going to be very involved in that process. This was a great final installment. We were concluding our 4-part series in collaboration with Covington. I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, and our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I again repeat our website, fdawatch.net. You can pick up all of the previous episodes in our podcast. We've been doing this podcast since January 2025. There are a lot of episodes that still stand because they're educational about the FDA processes. We know you don't want to miss any future episodes. To assure that, you go to fdawatch.net, you put in your email address, you press subscribe, and you will get notices every time there is a new episode. As we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.